He closed the folder first, slowly, like the sound might travel if he rushed it. The office door was already locked, but he reached back and checked it again anyway. His hand shook just enough that he noticed and tried to hide it by resting his palm flat against the table. "If you sign your engagement paperwork tonight," he said, lowering his voice, "you'll also assume federal financial liability tied to an identity you don't fully understand. Once that happens, there's no clean exit, not legally." I didn't respond right away. I watched the way his eyes avoided mine, the way the fluorescent light caught on the metal edge of the filing cabinet behind him. Something irreversible had already been set in motion. I could feel it. He slid a single page toward me, but kept his fingers on it, as if letting go too soon would make it real. "There's a recorded instruction attached to this file," he added. "It directly conflicts with the name you believe you're signing under." That was all he said. No explanation, no reassurance, just enough to fracture the future I'd walked in assuming was stable. My phone buzzed face down on the table. I didn't flip it over. I already knew who it would be. 2 hours earlier, I'd been standing in front of my bathroom mirror, fastening a bracelet I didn't love but wore anyway because it looked expensive enough to quiet questions. The engagement party was supposed to be easy, a formality, a box to check before the wedding machine really kicked into gear. That had become my default response over the past year. Thank you. The words lived permanently behind my teeth, polished and ready, whether someone complimented the ring or commented on how grounded I seemed compared to my fiancé's circle. Ethan liked to say I was low maintenance. His friends liked to say I was refreshing. His mother said I was lucky. At the party, the laughter came softly at first, disguised as warmth. Someone clinked a glass and joked about how Ethan had finally leveled up without the drama. Another woman, someone's cousin maybe, tilted her head and said she loved how I didn't try too hard. Simple, real. I smiled, because smiling kept things moving, because smiling kept the spotlight from lingering. When seating cards were passed around, mine was placed at the end of the table, near the kitchen doors. It wasn't an accident. Someone laughed when they realized, "Oh, sorry, we just assumed you'd want to be near the staff. You're so chill." Ethan squeezed my hand once, firm, reassuring, already turning back to finish a conversation about escrow timelines. He didn't look at me when he said, "It's fine, right?" Anger wants an audience. Alertness wants clarity. I took mental notes instead. Who spoke when Ethan wasn't around? Who lowered their voice when money came up? Who used my first name and who didn't bother at all? Later that night, while guests posed for photos under rented lights, Ethan stepped aside to answer a call. I caught only fragments as I passed, words like compliance, placeholder, already submitted. When I asked him about it, he smiled too quickly. "Just boring admin stuff. You don't need to stress about money." That phrase surfaced again now, in the locked office, as the man across from me finally removed his hand from the paper. "You should also know," he said carefully, "that a preliminary filing was submitted last week using your engagement date as an activation trigger." My stomach tightened. "Submitted by who?" He hesitated. That was answer enough. "There's also a date discrepancy, a signature logged before you were notified, and a third-party authorization attached to your fiancé's name. 3 microfractures, each one small, together catastrophic." My phone buzzed again. This time I turned it over. A text from Ethan. "Hey, everything good? Just wrapped. Big night for us." The man across from me leans back, folding his hands as if he'd already done more than he was supposed to. "He can't advise you on personal decisions," he said, "but if you move forward tonight without resolving this, you could be locked into liabilities that follow you for decades. Credit, tax exposure, federal classification issues. Identity, marriage, future, all braided together by paperwork I hadn't touched." I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my dress. I said, "Thank you." That had become my default response over the past year. Thank you. Outside, the evening air felt thinner than it should have. My phone rang before I reached my car. Ethan's name lit the screen, bright and confident. "Hey," he said when I answered, voice light, "you disappear on me?" I looked back at the building, at the lit window where my name sat attached to a file I'd never seen. "No," I said calmly. "I'm right where I need to be." He laughed, easy and certain. "Good, because after tonight, everything changes." He had no idea how true that was. I kept my voice steady when I stepped back into the house, the way you do when you know something's wrong, but you're not ready to let anyone smell it yet, and the air inside already felt tighter than it had an hour earlier, champagne flutes clinking a little too loud, laughter landing a little too sharp, the kind of laughter that pretends to be warm but is really just taking measurements. And for a moment, I simply stood there, letting the noise pass through me instead of reacting to it, reminding myself that observation was more useful than response. Ryan was near the kitchen island, sleeves rolled up, already playing hosts like this place had always been his domain, like tonight was just another box he'd checked. And when he saw me, he smiled in that controlled way that had once felt reassuring and now felt managerial, like I was a process he'd already optimized. And that realization settled quietly rather than painfully. Someone handed me a glass without asking if I wanted one, and I noticed how often that happened around his family. Decisions made on my behalf, small enough to seem polite, frequent enough to feel like a pattern, and I took a slow sip, buying myself a second to reset before moving further into the room. His mother leaned in toward a group of women I didn't know well, her voice carrying just enough to reach me, saying how proud she was that Ryan had finally settled down with someone uncomplicated, someone who didn't have expectations, and the word landed like a soft insult wrapped in a compliment, followed by a ripple of polite laughter that told me exactly who they thought I was in this story, a role already assigned, already agreed upon without my input. I smiled anyway, because smiling costs less than correcting people when you're still gathering information, and I caught Ryan's eye across the room, the way he watched the reaction before he watched me. A tiny pause that felt like confirmation rather than concern, like he was checking whether the system was still running smoothly. We'd met 2 years earlier at a charity event downtown, one of those low-key fundraisers where everyone pretends they're there for the cause, but still clocks what everyone else is wearing, and he'd seemed solid then, calm, good with numbers, the kind of guy friends describe as dependable, someone who figured things out without making noise. He talked about stability like it was a virtue and not a strategy, jokes that he wasn't flashy, just practical, said things like he liked things clean and simple, and I'd taken that as emotional maturity instead of what it really was, a preference for control disguised as restraint. In the months that followed, the red flags didn't arrive waving. They drifted in like background music, easy to ignore if you weren't listening closely. Comments about how paperwork stressed me out more than it needed to, reminders that in the US, everything came down to timing and signatures, little jokes about how I trusted my instincts too much and systems too little. And each time I hesitated, he'd smile and say, "Relax, this is my lane," like he was doing me a favor instead of narrowing my options. He offered to handle things, taxes, vendor contracts, the engagement venue deposit, and when I asked what something meant, he'd say we didn't need to get into the weeds, that it was standard, that everyone did it this way. And I remember the quiet relief I used to feel letting him take over, mistaking reduced effort for increased safety. At dinner with his cousins, one of them asked where my family was from, and before I could answer, Ryan jumped in with a polished version, smoothing out details, simplifying, editing me down to something more presentable. And when I corrected him later, he shrugged and said he was just keeping it easy, no need to complicate things. And I let it go because it felt small, and because calling it out would have required energy I wasn't ready to spend at the time. Tonight, every one of those moments replayed differently, especially after the call I'd taken earlier, after the lowered voice and the locked door, and the line that hadn't explained anything but had shifted the ground under my feet. I moved through the room slowly, noticing things I would have missed before, how Ryan's sister introduced me by my first name only, while using his full name with a title attached, how a friend joked about marrying up in a way that assumed I hadn't, how someone asked what I planned to do once we were married, as if the question itself carried instructions, and I let each moment register without reacting, cataloging rather than absorbing. Vanessa, who'd been warm to me from the start, squeezed my arm and said she loved my dress, then added, almost casually, that Ryan had mentioned I wasn't really into the financial side of things anyway, that I trusted him to handle it, and the way she said it told me she thought she was reassuring me, not realizing she'd just confirmed a version of me he'd been circulating without my consent. I nodded because correcting her would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer yet.
At the edge of the room, a table held a slim folder with our names embossed on the front, the engagement documents Ryan had mentioned earlier. Nothing urgent, he said, just a formality we could handle whenever. And I felt a quiet pull in my chest as I remembered how quickly he'd tried to move me past questions the last time I'd asked what exactly was inside, how he'd laughed and said it was all standard, 6 figures of responsibility spread across pages he'd already decided I didn't need to read closely. I didn't touch it. Instead, I stepped outside to the back patio, the night air cool and clarifying, my phone already in my hand. And when I called Miss Harris, she didn't pretend to be surprised to hear from me again, just asked where I was and whether I was alone. And when I told her it was the engagement party, she paused, then said she'd send what she could, but that some items would require verification, her tone careful in a way that told me there was more there than she was allowed to put into words yet. Inside, the party swelled, someone clinked a glass to get attention, and I watched through the window as Ryan raised his head, confident, already preparing to speak, already assuming the timing belonged to him. My phone buzzed once with a message preview that showed a dollar amount high enough to tighten my jaw, followed by a legal term I recognized just enough to know it didn't belong anywhere near a celebration, and I slipped the phone back into my pocket before anyone could see my face change. When I returned to the room, Ryan reached for my hand, his grip firm, expectant, and whispered we'd do the paperwork after the toast. No rush, but no reason to drag it out either. And I nodded because nodding buys you time, and time is leverage when you know how to use it. As he spoke to the room about partnership and trust, about building something solid, I listened to the gaps between his words, the assumptions doing most of the work, and I understood, finally, that this wasn't about love going wrong, but about a system being used exactly the way it was designed, by someone who believed signatures mattered more than consent, and calmness meant compliance. I raised my glass when everyone else did, my smile measured, my silence deliberate. And the applause hit, I felt something settle instead of break, the shift from unease to clarity, because I wasn't deciding whether to confront him, I was deciding when, and those are very different choices.
Claire sat in the dimly lit office, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead blending with the faint shuffle of papers. Miss Harris's eyes were sharp, her hands steady despite the tremor she'd tried to mask as she closed the file in front of Claire. If you finalize anything tonight, you could unknowingly assume liabilities totaling over 6 figures, tied to accounts you don't control and debts that aren't yours, she said quietly, voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of irrevocable consequences. Claire didn't respond, letting the words sink in, her pulse steady, mind scanning every subtle nuance in Miss Harris's demeanor. Every breath in the room felt measured, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down to a trap she already saw coming. She noted the folders stacked on the corner desk, embossed with bank seals, notarized affidavits, and carefully timed loan documents. A shell company with a balance she hadn't expected, a dormant account with several $1,000s funneled into offshore conduits, each entry a silent siren, each signature a tether she might unwittingly grab if she made a single misstep. Her phone buzzed, a muted vibration, and she slid her thumb across the screen to see a text from Vanessa. "Party looks perfect. He has no idea you're outside." Claire allowed herself the faintest smirk. Vanessa meant well, unaware she had just repeated details Ryan had let slip during last week's pre-party dinner, hinting at the transfer clauses embedded in the prenuptial addendum. Every small confession Vanessa offered, unguarded and naive, was another thread in Claire's growing web of clarity. She pressed the call to Miss Harris. "I need full disclosure on all associated trusts and pending liabilities, every single document, tonight." The calm in her voice belied the storm of strategy forming in her mind. A soft click announced another incoming email. She opened the attachment, eyes narrowing. A loan in Ryan's name, approved weeks ago, listed as personal but implicitly tied to an unregistered property asset. The timing aligned perfectly with the engagement night plans. Any signature from her would trigger automatic liability transfer. Micro-twist #4. The account had already been partially drawn upon. Micro-twist #5. The supposed investment fund was a front for a defaulted business loan she had almost co-signed on a casual dinner night, laughing it off at the time. Micro-twist #6. A third-party waiver quietly included in the legal packet, scheduled to expire the next day, could have locked her into co-responsibility if she had been unaware.
Her mind replayed the past months with surgical precision. The dinners where Ryan casually referenced tax structures, the weekend brunch where trust alignment had been mentioned in passing, the subtle nudges to initial paperwork without explanation. Every hint she had filed away mentally now fit perfectly into a blueprint of deception. The realization was quiet, almost clinical, yet it solidified her resolve. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and allowed her thoughts to shift from confusion to controlled clarity. This wasn't anger. This was a strategic calculation, and she had the upper hand because she had observed, recorded, and prepared without ever letting a flicker of emotion betray her understanding. Meanwhile, the engagement party swirled on, laughter and the clinking of glasses drifting faintly through the office window. Ryan, unaware of her tactical withdrawal, continued to entertain the crowd with charm calibrated to impress. Every toast, every polite compliment he offered was a performance he believed she was blind to. He assumed control, she assumed observation. Her absence was her strategy, her stillness a shield. The subtle tension of the office, the documents, the calculated risks she now knew she could avoid, it all contrasted sharply with the bright, oblivious celebration outside. Claire picked up the final document, an almost innocuous addendum to a trust account labeled with her future initials. She smiled to herself. The design of the trap was flawless, layered across multiple channels, hidden debts, pre-signed waivers, loan accounts in her name, and yet in all this, she had not signed a thing, not one line, not one form. Each piece of evidence now awaited the precise moment of exposure, timed perfectly with the subtle cues of social navigation she had memorized over the past weeks. Her phone vibrated. Again, Vanessa's text read, "He's bragging about the pre-party negotiations. You're missing the show." Claire's lips curved upward ever so slightly. She typed back nothing. Observation was her weapon tonight. Every micro moment mattered. Every unnoticed detail at the party could be leveraged for later revelation. The house was a stage. The guests were unwitting participants, and Ryan, as always, was the star in his own illusion of victory. Claire allowed herself to review the sequence silently, the dormant accounts, the financial trap masked as opportunity, the unwitting disclosures from Vanessa, the micro moments she had almost signed off on, each now poised as a future reveal. She leaned forward to scan a notarized ledger showing liabilities in her name contingent on marital co-signature. 6 figures, the sum nearly palatable in casual conversation, yet explosive when deployed strategically. Every penny accounted for, every potential loophole identified and secured against. Back at the engagement, Ryan laughed at a comment from a cousin, unaware of the calm calculation unfolding in the office just a few blocks away. The subtle cues that had been ignored for months now formed a precise map of his hubris. He thought she was clueless. He thought she was absent. He thought the party's energy had her distracted. He was wrong. Claire's awareness was complete, her control total. Every financial line, every document, every whispered misstep from others had been cataloged and preserved. She checked her reflection in the office window, composed, steady, and entirely unreadable. Her breathing remained even, her posture elegant, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the ledger. She was the picture of calm. Micro twist after micro twist aligned perfectly, waiting for activation. The silent preparation was now complete, the chain of inevitability forming as meticulously as a chess game where every pawn and bishop had already moved in her mind. Claire rose, sliding the folder carefully into a secure envelope and tucked it in her bag. One glance at the party lights through the glass confirmed the scene. Ryan's carefully curated image was unshaken. The guests were oblivious to the undercurrents flowing just beyond their vision. She allowed herself a private, almost imperceptible nod. Timing, not impulse, would dictate tonight's outcome. She would let the party continue, each toast, each laugh, each polite applause, feeding the setup for the ultimate reveal. A final look at the documents showed the full scope: shell accounts, fake business success, loans in her future husband's name, but contingent on her signature, all meticulously connected to the engagement's legal framework. She had anticipated every possible objection, every contingency, every subtle legal trap, and yet she had not signed a single line. Every micro twist she had gathered now aligned perfectly with her internal plan: observation, preservation, patient deployment. As the sounds of champagne corks and polite laughter drifted faintly through the office window, Claire allowed herself a small, controlled exhale. She did not rush, she did not panic, she did not react. Ryan, the crowd, the orchestrated social performance outside, all of it was part of the stage, one she had learned to navigate silently, strategically, and flawlessly. She stepped back, leaving the documents secured, letting the party continue without interference, letting Ryan believe in his own perceived victory. The micro twists were poised, the legal traps intact, and her understanding complete. Tonight, she would remain unseen, undisturbed, entirely in control, while the seeds of his eventual unraveling quietly germinated. Claire's lips curved into the smallest smile. She had done nothing, and yet she had already won. Claire stepped back from the edge of the office window, the golden glow from the engagement hall spilling faintly across the marble floor, and adjusted the strap of her purse with deliberate calm. The city outside hummed quietly, but inside, her world was meticulously mapped, every document cross-referenced, every number verified. Miss Harris's office had become a quiet battlefield. Papers lay stacked, files locked, and emails kinged intermittently with attachments marked confidential. She glanced at the screen: six-figure sums, layered liabilities, shell accounts tied back to Ryan's signature, every layer meticulously orchestrated. Each line of data revealed a subtle micro-twist: a loan approved in Ryan's name months before, an unreported trust that shifted potential financial exposure, a waiver that, if she signed it blindly at the engagement, would have transferred responsibility to her entirely. Her eyes skimmed the highlighted figures, tracing the arcs of potential fallout like a chess player visualizing moves 6 steps ahead. She exhaled lightly and turned toward the locked drawer, where one final folder rested: pre-signed documents she had prepared with Mr. Thompson's guidance. Not a single signature had yet touched the trap she had designed. Quietly, she considered the engagement hall. She could hear laughter filtered faintly through the glass. Ryan was working the crowd, his confident smile hiding the micro cracks he had been patiently observing. She imagined the passive hierarchy, the polite nods, the forced compliments, Vanessa leaning just slightly too close, sharing information Ryan believed was secret, her own naivety amplifying the exposure. Claire's lips curved into the faintest acknowledgement of the inevitable. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Sliding the folder into her tote, she checked her watch, a ritual of timing. Every move, every observation, every accidental cue she had left throughout the party would converge tonight. Her phone buzzed softly, a brief message from Vanessa, harmless in intention, yet betraying Ryan's casual arrogance. Claire read it, eyes steady, then pocketed the phone, letting the subtle shock of discovery linger like a whisper. Micro-twists had been set for maximum effect. The missing financial disclosure she had quietly flagged weeks ago, the shell accounts, the liabilities hidden in plain sight. Every document was a deliberate seed of unraveling. At the party, the scene was pristine. Guests clustered in small groups, champagne flutes catching the ambient light. Ryan moved among them, animated, projecting control, unaware of the silent countdown ticking through Claire's calculated plan. She had allowed a slight delay in her own entrance into the hall, giving him the illusion of advantage. Now, seated near the window's reflection, she observed him narrowly. Subtle gestures, the flicker of impatience, the adjusted cufflinks, the faint tightening of his jaw when Vanessa mentioned a contract clause he had assumed secure, all signals she had been trained to read. Her strategic calm contrasted the simmering tension beneath his polished exterior. Claire's mind revisited the chain of micro-twists she had meticulously assembled: the engagement license, the pre-signed protective documents, the carefully coordinated emails with Miss Harris, the silent witnesses she had placed, and the innocuous-seeming instructions she had left for Brooke, the friend whose presence had been intentionally misleading. Each piece interacted with the next, designed to collapse the carefully curated image Ryan projected. She imagined the domino effect, the polite hush when authority intervened, the controlled pause of the room, the subtle shift in attention away from her composure to the factual unraveling of Ryan's maneuver. She leaned back, adjusting the soft folds of her dress, observing without interference. The first micro-twist had just activated. Brooke had excused herself, citing a fabricated emergency, leaving Ryan slightly unmoored, a subtle crack in his assumption of support. The second micro-twist had been triggered days ago, a deliberately timed notice from the bank alerting Ryan to a procedural review. Third, the pre-signed document she had drafted under Miss Harris's supervision would silently assert legal standing once introduced. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation required. Every step was invisible yet inevitable, a chain reaction set into motion with precision. As Ryan approached the area near the toast podium, his expression sharpened. He could feel the shift without knowing its source. Claire's eyes flicked to the mirror behind the dessert table, reflections of concerned smiles, polite murmurs, and the faint tightening of guests' attention. She remained seated, the soft ambient lighting tracing the contours of her calm, unreadable face. She was not acting, she was orchestrating. Every laugh, every subtle nod, every faint raising of eyebrows became a part of a larger pattern of revelation. Her strategy had always been to let him collapse under his own arrogance. She did not intervene, she allowed observation and preparation to do their work. The room's energy began to shift imperceptibly. Micro-twists continued. Vanessa's accidental slip revealed an overlooked clause from Ryan's early corporate filings. The Shell account's pre-signed document's existence was quietly noted by Miss Harris, her gaze signaling readiness without comment. Subtle financial inconsistencies flagged by automated alerts had already begun the silent undermining of his projected security. The engagement, once a symbol of triumph for Ryan, now functioned as a platform for exposure, a stage upon which the truth would rise methodically. Claire sipped lightly from her glass, her composure intact, the faintest smirk acknowledging the inevitability of each consequence. The toast began. Ryan lifted his glass, projecting confidence, unaware that each statement he made was measured against the chain of evidence Claire had laid bare. Guests listened, their focus shifting subtly to the sequence of events Claire had orchestrated, contracts referenced in passing, financial implications hinted at through casual conversation, and the strategic positioning of witnesses who would later confirm her narrative without dramatics. Silence became an instrument, authority a collaborator, and patience a weapon. Claire observed, fully aware of the room's evolving dynamics. She had already decided not to speak beyond the softest acknowledgments. When prompted by a curious glance or raised eyebrow, she would allow documentation and strategic visibility to convey the reality. Ryan's facade was beginning to crack. Slight hesitations, micro-adjustments in posture, rapid scanning of faces seeking assurance. Every calculated step she had taken months prior was converging. The room remained oblivious to the orchestration, seeing only subtle shifts, polite gasps, and controlled glances. Minutes passed with methodical patience. Claire's final micro-twist for the evening had been quietly set into motion, a procedural note from Miss Harris confirming that certain liabilities were now legally recognized under Ryan's signature, not hers. The document's activation was silent but irreversible. Ryan's perception of control began to crumble. No one shouted, no one pointed fingers. Silence conveyed more impact than any dramatized accusation could convey. Every observer noted the tension without fully understanding its origin. As the toast concluded, Claire allowed herself a soft exhale. She remained seated, her posture poised, calm, and controlled. Ryan, increasingly aware of subtle shifts, tried to recover his composure, but the micro-twists and authority signals had already created a network of consequences he could not visibly counter. Her smile, quiet and unreadable, conveyed victory without noise. She had not acted impulsively, she had acted strategically, letting patience, planning, and documented preparation determine the outcome. The engagement collapsed under the weight of its own design. Authority had intervened without dramatics. Guests were quietly adjusting to the realignment of social hierarchy. Claire had ensured the future remained protected, the child's welfare safeguarded, and her own dignity preserved. She stood finally, adjusting her clutch, and moved steadily to the side, observing without interference. Ryan was escorted briefly to clarify procedural matters, his aura of confidence diminished in ways no guest fully registered. The room's attention remained neutral, polite, yet perceptibly shifted. Claire's calm, intelligence-driven orchestration had succeeded. No screams, no chaos, only the quiet, undeniable consequence of strategic patience and legal precision. She had set the timing, controlled the pacing, and allowed truth to emerge methodically. Claire glanced once more at the fading reflections in the window. The evening light cast long, soft shadows across the hall. She walked slowly toward the exit, her steps measured, her composure absolute. The chain of micro-twists had concluded, the authority allies had executed their roles seamlessly, and the engagement, a stage for control, had revealed its inherent truth. She did not revel, she observed. She did not gloat, she smiled quietly, knowing that the system had acted exactly as intended. She had achieved her objective, dignity preserved, strategic victory realized, and a future safeguarded. The night closed not with drama, but with controlled resolution, the calm before the inevitable aftermath. The room had quieted to a gentle hum, the soft clink of glasses fading into an almost imperceptible background noise. I took a measured breath, letting the warmth of the hall settle around me, aware of every pair of eyes glancing in my direction. Ryan stood by the podium, forcing a confident smile that no longer reached his eyes, subtly shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as if trying to find footing in a story he no longer controlled. The toast had begun, yet I remained calm, a composed figure at the periphery, my posture steady, my mind entirely in the documents now resting in my bag. Copies of trust agreements, waiver clauses, loan confirmations, and audit notes, all prepared weeks in advance. Each paper represented a silent lever, a methodical unraveling of the carefully constructed illusion Ryan had spun around our engagement, around my compliance, around everyone's perception of him. I let my gaze sweep the room, noting small changes in expressions, the subtle shifts that betrayed a new awareness creeping among the guests. Vanessa lingered nearby, her face registering confusion and mild unease, unknowingly having shared a fragment of a conversation Ryan had trusted to remain private. She was no villain, merely a thread in a tapestry she didn't fully understand, yet her unguarded remark added pressure to the system I had quietly activated. The juxtaposition of her innocent disclosure with Ryan's mounting tension created an almost imperceptible ripple through the room, a chain of micro-twists that the audience would never see coming until the final frame of this evening. I allowed my mind a brief pause, a fraction of a second to absorb the scene, noting the warm glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished floors, the soft shadows that danced against walls and corners, the quiet murmurs of curiosity and polite concern. In that instant, I felt the subtle shift of power from an outwardly charismatic figure to one whose authority was eroding under the weight of documentation, preparation, and calm observation. There was no need to rush, no need to raise my voice, no need to make a scene. The system was moving exactly as it had been designed, and I was merely its orchestrator. The first micro-twist came as the catering staff delivered an unexpected tray of champagne flutes, causing Ryan to step slightly aside and brush against the stack of legal documents I had placed strategically on the small side table near the podium. His reaction, a barely perceptible grimace, was not lost on me. Subtle, almost invisible, yet perfectly timed, a hint of the consequences he could no longer control. I noted the exact amount of liabilities documented earlier, the 7-figure figures resting silently in those pages, legal clauses confirming that any transfer of wealth through marriage would now be entirely scrutinized and voided if misrepresented. Ryan thought he had shielded these details, but the chain of preparation, audit notices, and liability freezes had already been triggered. I glanced briefly toward Miss Harris, my authority ally, standing discreetly in a corner, her posture calm but alert. She caught my eye with the faintest nod, a signal that all protective measures were in place. Pre-signed documents ready to be filed, witnesses present without any spectacle, bank alerts activated, and legal letters queued for immediate delivery. Every contingency Ryan assumed he had managed was quietly accounted for. He believed control still lay in his hands, but the invisible architecture of patience and preparation had shifted the entire framework. As Ryan attempted to deliver his toast, his words smooth and rehearsed, there was a subtle pause in his cadence. His audience sensed the change even if they couldn't articulate it, a tension in the air that suggested the evening was no longer about celebration, but observation. I smiled softly, not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction. Nothing dramatic, no public humiliation necessary. The papers would speak, the systems would respond, and Ryan would unravel under the inevitability of his own choices. The second micro-twist arrived when one of the secondary guests, previously aligned with Ryan, excused herself from the table, her expression revealing a dawning comprehension of hidden financial traps, loans registered under Ryan's name, shell accounts subtly linked to our engagement. She had no intent to betray, yet her movement and demeanor subtly confirmed the chain reaction I had anticipated. Small, controlled, entirely unavoidable in hindsight, exactly how slow-burn justice unfolds. I remained at the edge of the crowd, observing the micro-shifts, aware that every guest now carried a fragment of awareness, a recognition that this engagement was less about love and more about a meticulously constructed legal and financial web. Ryan's once commanding posture faltered as he caught the gaze of a bank official stationed discreetly near the hall, a silent reminder that audit measures were active, that liabilities could no longer be transferred, that his public image might collapse quietly without spectacle. A third micro-twist emerged as I reached for my clutch, fingers brushing the edge of the protective filings. I allowed Ryan to catch the motion out of the corner of his eye, subtle enough to avoid panic, significant enough to signal preparation and readiness. The room's lighting softened around us, amber tones highlighting the careful composition of the event. Elegance, warmth, tension, observation. I felt the quiet rhythm of the evening align with my intentions. Patience, intelligence, control. I allowed myself a few moments with an emotional mirror, a brief exchange across the room, our eyes locking with unspoken understanding. No tears, no dramatics, just recognition of the meticulous process we had enacted, the foresight that protected our future, the clarity that had transformed unease into a measured calm. Ryan misread the interaction, seeing only polite attention, unaware that his facade had already been systematically dismantled. The final micro-twist arrived when Ryan, attempting to regain composure, adjusted his cufflinks and straightened his tie, unaware that the ultimate document, the clause he had underestimated, rested in the hands of the legal liaison. A single signature in the wrong place, a forgotten liability notice, the culmination of months of preparation quietly waiting to be executed. No spectacle, no shouting, just the inevitability of consequences catching up silently, perfectly, and entirely unavoidable. I stepped slightly back, allowing the toast to continue without interruption, my smile calm, composed, and deliberate. The ambient glow of the room framed the quiet revolution, Ryan's image intact only in appearance, slowly eroding under the weight of professional scrutiny, the guests none the wiser to the full extent, yet subtly aware of the tension, the hall elegant, warm, deceptive in its calm. I did not need to speak. The documents, the preparation, and the chain of small truths were already doing the work. As the evening wound down, I allowed myself a final scan of the room, reflections in the polished surfaces, shadows elongating softly across the floor, subtle gestures of unease from Ryan, and the faint reassurance of allies quietly in place. There was no over-the-top flourish, no dramatic confrontation, no instant wealth or victory. Instead, there was the profound stillness of control regained, the quiet dignity of a life untouched by deception, and the absolute knowledge that the future, protected, calm, and free, was mine to shape. I walked away from the podium, the event continuing behind me in muted celebration, knowing the chain of consequences would unfold silently but inevitably. Ryan followed, unaware that each step he took was measured, his autonomy quietly constrained by the meticulous preparation I had orchestrated. The final files would be filed, the liabilities frozen, the legal systems engaged, and the emotional closure fully secured. I stepped slightly back at the threshold of the hall, allowing one last glance over the room. Elegance, tension, awareness, and subtle revelation all interwoven. A soft exhale, a slight adjustment of my dress, and I stepped out into the night, leaving the quiet chaos and slow unraveling behind. I didn't walk away richer. I walked away untouched, free.